we decided to start with war poetry from the First World War. And it threw up the most enormous amount of poets. And previously, Napoleon had described this country as a nation of shopkeepers, but actually it should more fairly, certainly at that time, have been described as a nation of poets. I think in 1914, in common with a lot of the other countries that were involved, there was a spirit of enormous patriotism, idealism, a kind of chivalric revival. And then, of course, these young men arrived in France and in Belgium, and things started to change. So you see an enormous change over the 4 years of war. You start with this enthusiasm that becomes sadder, more tragic, and ultimately very angry. And what I've tried to do is include in this selection of poems something that exemplifies that. And a lot of these poets were killed. Some, of course, survived. Some continued to write poetry after the end of the war, but an awful lot of them didn't. For example, Siegfried Sassoon was became a very famous war poet. His writing after the war was really not very much. It was certainly not in anything in comparison with what he had written during the war. And he was one of those young men who went out and returned angry and embittered. He handed back his MC, which is a very, very high order of gallantry, the Military Cross. And he handed that back as an expression of his anger. So what I thought we'd start with was something that was written by Robert Service, who did survive. And he's taken a very, very famous song that was sung by these marching men when they went out. And he's written a long poem, which I won't read the whole of, I'll just read a small section, but you'll get the mood of what was going on then in the very early days. And he calls it Tipperary Days. Tipperary was a town in Ireland. Mm-hmm. So, oh, weren't they the fine boys? You never saw the beat of them. Singing all together with their throats bronze bare, fighting fit and mirth mad, music in the feet of them, swinging on to glory and the wrath out there, laughing by and chaffing by, frolic in the smiles of them, on the road, the white road, all the afternoon, strangers in a strange land, miles and miles and miles of them, battle-bound and heart high, and singing this tune. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, and the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye Piccadilly, farewell Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. So you get a sense of this gaiety, really, this gaiety, this expectation of glory, really, of glory. And I'm now going to move on to a very, very famous poem written by T.P. Cameron Wilson, who was killed in action in 1918. And it's one of those poems. Is Flanders Field and Magpies in Piccadilly were very famous at the time. So this is Magpies in Piccadilly. The magpies in Piccadilly are more than I can tell. They flicker down the dusty roads and cast a magic spell on the men who march through Piccadilly to hell. The blackbird flies with panic, the swallow goes with light, the finches move like ladies, the owl floats by at night. But the great and flashing magpie, he flies as artists might. A magpie in Piccadilly told me secret things of the music in white feathers and the sunlight that sings and dances in deep shadows. He told me with his wings. The hawk is cruel and rigid, he watches from a height. The rook is slow and sombre, the robin loves to fight. But the great and flashing magpie, he flies as lovers might. He told me that in Piccadilly, an age ago or more, while all his fathers still were eggs, these dusty highways bore brown, singing soldiers marching out through Piccadilly to war. He said that still through chaos works on the ancient plan, and two things have altered not since first the world began: the beauty of the wild green earth and the bravery of man. For the sparrow flies unthinking and quarrels in his flight. The heron trails his legs behind, the lark goes out of sight. But the great and flashing magpie, he flies as poets might. He was killed, as I said. This is written by another young man who was killed. He was killed in 1916, and his name is Alan Seeger. And this also was a very, very famous poem called Rendezvous. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade, when spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air. I have a rendezvous with death when spring brings back blue days and fair. It may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land and close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope of battered hill when spring comes round again this year and the first meadow flowers appear. God knows 'twere better to be deep pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true. I shall not fail that rendezvous. And this poem was written by Julian Grenfell. Julian Grenfell died of wounds in 1915, so he didn't survive very long. And his two brothers followed him shortly after. So there were 3 sons in that family, all of whom died. And this poem, called Into Battle, was incredibly famous at the time and subsequently. And it is very much the poem of the young warrior, you know, and all what I said earlier on about the notion, this chivalric dream is embodied in this poem. And of course, he didn't live long enough to feel the change. So this is Into Battle. The naked earth is warm with spring, and with green grass and bursting trees, leans to the sun's gaze, glorying, and quivers in the sunny breeze. And life is colour and warmth and light, and a striving evermore for these. And he is dead who will not fight, and who dies fighting hath increase. The fighting man shall from the sun take warmth, and life from the glowing earth, Speed with the light-foot winds to run, and with the trees to newer birth, and find when fighting shall be done, great rest and fullness after dearth. All the bright company of heaven hold him in their high comradeship, the dog's star and the sisters seven, Orion's belt and sordid hip. The woodland trees that stand together, they stand to him, each one a friend. They gently speak in the windy weather. They guide to valley and ridge's end. The kestrel hovering by day, and the little owls that call by night, bid him be swift and keen as they, as keen of ear and swift of sight. The blackbird sings to him, brother, brother, if this be the last song you shall sing, sing well, for you may not sing another. Brother, sing. In dreary, doubtful, waiting hours, before the brazen frenzy starts, the horses show him nobler powers. Oh, patient eyes, courageous hearts. And when the burning moment breaks and all things else are out of mind, and only joy of battle takes him by the throat and makes him blind, through joy and blindness he shall know, not caring much to know, that still nor lead nor steel shall reach him, so that it be not the destined will. The thundering line of battle stands, and in the air death moans and sings, but day shall clasp him with strong hands, and night shall fold him in soft wings. This is a very, very different poem. This is written by a man who did survive, Robert Nichols, and he's describing, he was an officer, and he's describing what he saw possibly a day ago. And it's, you know, it has the kind of the immediacy of, say, a documentary in our days. And it's short. It's called The Eve of Assault, Infantry Going Down to the Trenches. Right. Downward slopes the wild red sun. We lie around a waiting gun. Soon we shall load and fire and load. But hark, a sound beats down the road. Hello, what's up? Let's have a look. Come on, Ginger, drop that book. What the hell of a bloody noise? It's the Yorks and Lanks, me boys. So we crowd. Here, watch them come, one man drubbing on a drum, a crazy, high mouth organ blowing, tin cans rattling, cat calls crowing, and above their rhythmic feet, a whirl of shrilling loud and sweet, round mouths whistling in unison, shouts, who's going out to the Un? Back us up, mates, Gord, we will! Leave them shells at the Kaiser Bill. Art from Lancashire, me lad? Give 'em a cheer, boys, make 'em glad. Hip, hurrah, give Fritz the chuck. Good old bloody Yorks, good luck. Cheer. I cannot cheer or speak, lest my voice, my heart should break. Many of these poets, as you know, died very early. And this man here, whose poem is called Untitled, well, obviously he didn't give it a title, he died at the incredibly early age of 20. He had already published one book of poems, and it's more than likely he could have become, you know, a really great poet. 20 years old, nothing. So, Untitled. When you see millions of the mouthless dead. Across your dreams in pale battalions go. Say not soft things, as other men have said, that you'll remember, for you need not so. Give them not praise, for deaf, how should they know it is not curses heaped on each gashed head? Nor tears, the blind eyes see not your tears flow, nor honour, it is easy to be dead. Say only this, they are dead, then add thereto, yet many a better one has died before. Then scanning all the o'ercrowded mass, should you perceive one face that you loved heretofore, it is a spook. None wears the face you knew. Great death has made all his forevermore. Probably the most famous poet, certainly at the beginning of the war, was Rupert Brooke. I haven't actually included his poem, but he represented, I suppose, he was an astonishingly brilliant and beautiful young man who died of wounds during the Gallipoli campaign. And you can look up his poems, which were immensely famous at the time. But what I've chosen instead is In Flanders Fields. This was written by John McCrae, who died of his wounds in 1918. And of course, the poppy is the emblem of the First World War. And I think probably this poem had as much to do with that choice as any. So In Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Field. And the next poem was written by W.B. Yeats. And he wrote this in memory of the son of his great friend, Lady Gregory, who was an airman. And I think it was the only, well, he was, of course, an Irishman. It was the only poem he wrote about the First World War. An Irish airman foresees his death. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross. My countrymen, Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss or leave them happier than before. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. And the next poem is very, very different. It's written by Gilbert Franco, who was a essayist, poet. He survived the war. And I should imagine he was present at the scene that this poem depicts. It's called The Deserter. It's very short. "I'm sorry I done it, Major." We bandaged the livid face and led him out ere the one sun rose to die his death of disgrace. The bolt heads locked to the cartridge, the rifles steadied to rest, as cold stock nestled at colder cheek, and foresight lined on the breast. "Fire!" called the sergeant major. The muzzles flamed as he spoke, and the shameless soul of a nameless man went up in the cordite smoke. I think some years ago, all those men who deserted were pardoned, and rightly so. They were suffering, they'd been exposed, some of them for 3 or 4 years, to this remorseless horror. And who could possibly blame them? And of course, those men were shot as an example. And it was only much, much later in the war, I think, with the work of a particular doctor whose name I've forgotten, who realized what was happening to these men and wanted to get them out and to a hospital in Scotland where they could recover their equilibrium and possibly, not go back to the war. And of course, it was Craig Lockhart. That's right, that's the name of the hospital. And it was at Craig Lockhart that Siegfried Sassoon met Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen was there. I think they were both of them wounded and exhausted. And Siegfried Sassoon saw and read Wilfred Owen's poetry and tried to persuade him not to go back. And he failed. Anyway, that's that story. But before we get to Wilfred Owen, here is a poem written by a young man who was killed in action in 1916. And he, of course, all the officers had to write to the families of these young men who died. And he is writing, this man, E.A. Mackintosh. He calls the poem In Memoriam, and he writes underneath, "Private D. Sutherland, killed in action in the German trench, May the 16th, 1916, and the others who died." And he himself survived, a matter of weeks, months, but was dead. And this is a very different kind of poem. It is, you'll see. "So you were David's father, and he was your only son, and the new cut peats are rotting, and the work is left undone because of an old man weeping, just an old man in pain, for David, his son David, that will not come again. Oh, the letters he wrote you, and I can see them still, not a word of the fighting, but just the sheep on the hill, and how you should get the crops in, ere the year gets stormier, and the Boche have got his body, and I was his officer. You were only David's father, but I had 50 sons when we went up in the evening under the arch of the guns, and we came back at twilight. Oh God, I heard them call to me for help and pity, that could not help at all. Oh, never will I forget you, my men that trusted me, more my sons than your fathers, for they could only see the little helpless babies and the young men in their pride. They could not see you dying and hold you while you died. Happy and young and gallant, they saw their firstborn go, but not the strong limbs broken and the beautiful men brought low. The piteous, writhing bodies, they screamed, "Don't leave me, sir!" But they were only your fathers, but I was your officer. And I think what's often been remarked, or more than remarked, is that this country was and still is, divided by class as much as anything. In that war, it was the first time, or certainly in recent history, where officers and men were together. They went through it together, and that created a huge bond. And it was after the war that they created the British Legion, which was, to memorialize these people and the bonds that were created. And you hear that in that poem, that man who has to carry the grief of these young men under his command who are never coming back. And there's another poem written by Robert Graves that I've included called The Two Fusiliers, which exemplifies that bond. And we'll come to that a little bit later. This next one is written by Wilfred Owen, and it's called Anthem for Doomed Youth. And, some of his poems are about being there in the trenches. This is more about the people at home, the people who will mourn those young men who will never come back again. So, Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for those who die as cattle. Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries for them from prayers or bells, nor any voice of mourning, save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. This is Two Fusiliers that I mentioned by Robert Graves, who did, by incredible good fortune, survive. And he went on to write an amazing book called Goodbye to All That, which is a really astonishing piece of writing about his war. So, Two Fusiliers. And have we done with war at last? Well, we've been lucky devils both, and there's no need of pledge or oath to bind our lovely friendship fast. By firmer stuff, close bound enough. By wire and wood and stake we're bound. By fricourt and festubert. By whipping rain by the sun's glare, by all the misery and loud sound, by a spring day, by Picard clay. Show me the two so closely bound as we, by the wet bond of blood, by friendship blossoming from mud, by death we faced him, and we found beauty in death, in dead men, breath. And the last one I've chosen is called Aftermath. It's written by Siegfried Sassoon, and it was written after the war in 1919. And it gives expression to his anger and despair. Have you forgotten yet? For the world's events have rumbled on since those gagged days, like traffic checked while at the crossing of city ways. And the haunted gap in your mind has filled with thoughts that flow like clouds in the lit heaven of life. And you're a man reprieved to go, taking your peaceful share of time with joy to spare. But the past is just the same, and war's a bloody game. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget. Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Mametz? The nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on parapets? Do you remember the rats and the stench of corpses rotting in front of the front line trench, and dawn coming dirty white and chill with a hopeless rain? Do you ever stop and ask, is it all going to happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before the attack, and the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you then as you peered at the doomed and haggard voices of your men? Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back with dying eyes and lolling heads? Those ashen grey masks of the lads who once were keen and kind and gay. Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget.
Mm. Thank you, Kristin. It was really a challenge to go through it all, through this amount of despair. And I'm thinking back about our interview with Tom, who said people should be ready to die for their country. After that, you wouldn't understand what it means at all. You would want to have no countries to die for.